Alright, hi guys. So video for May 7th, 2020. Our last and two final key concepts of the entire units. So this is it. There will be no more new information. Everything from here until the AP exam is going to be reviewing strategies on DBQ stuff. So it's going to be no more content. It's going to be focusing more on skill-based things. And so I thought it'd be kind of funny to put the little picture of the owls on there. Teacher at the beginning of the year, teacher at the end of the year. Because that's totally what I feel like today. But hopefully you guys are excited and you're ready. A lot of stuff did go out on the announcements about cleaning out the lockers, announcements about registering for school, announcements about Teacher Appreciation Week, announcements about AP exams. They are going to have a webinar for parents and things like that for more information. And then as always, if you have any questions, reach out. So let's go ahead and get started so we can get through as quickly as possible. Okay, so 6.6 causes of migration. What is the essential question? What environmental and economic factors contributed to patterns of migration between 1750 and 1900? So context and background. Imperialism had led to a global economy that encouraged migration in search of opportunity, so people moved looking for jobs. Industrialization pushed many people to urban centers. People had to move to the cities because the factories were in the cities, and that's where the jobs were. And the demand for new forms of labor after the abolition of slavery led to new forms of forced labor, coerced labor, which is another word for forced, and semi-coerced migration. So it's another way of saying slavery in a nice way. All right, so some background again. Migration through labor systems. Slavery was ending around the world, but the demand for resources was continuing to increase. So even though the labor or the types of labor that were needed was changing as far as regulation goes, the demand was still there. And so this resulted in European states looking for new types of laborers to work on plantations. So for example, you had Indian laborers who were going to the British colonies. You had Chinese laborers who were going to California and British Malaya to work on the railroads. You had Japanese laborers who were going to Hawaii, Peru, and Cuba to work on the sugar plantations. Slavery itself had been abolished in most places, but the practice would continue for many, many years. So there would be places that had made proclamations, or they had passed laws to kind of do away with it. But in some states and in some areas, in some regions, you would see people that found loopholes to it. So the United States, Cuba, and Brazil are going to be some of the very last places to end slavery. Africans continued to enslave one another even well into the 1900s, and they did it for economic purposes. Then you have indentured servitude. An indentured servitude, or being an indentured servant, is a way for poor people to get more opportunities. So traveling from one country to another country was extremely expensive. So a lot of the times, many of them sold themselves into this type of slavery or service as a way to get from one place to another for opportunity, for freedom, to be able to help take care of their families back home. Now, once these people went as indentured servants to a different place to go work, they would usually send money back home to their family members, and then sometimes they would stay only for a short time, only temporarily, until they could get their family back on their feet, and then sometimes they moved permanently. If their opportunity was great enough for them and it was a better living situation, they ended up staying there. For example, Asian contract laborers, a lot of them were forced or tricked to replace slaves. The media would get a hold or get wind of this, and they would make a big deal about it because it's another form of slavery. They would sign these contracts, and they were usually so let me just break it down really quickly. Indentured servitude, it's a limited amount of time. These Asian contract laborers, they were under contract forever, pretty much. And so this type of new form of slavery would be banned in most places by the 1870s. Okay, so then we also go back to the penal colonies. So other types of labor systems or migration systems is going to be the French penal colonies. So prisoners were sent to these colonies in Africa, New Caledonia, and French Guiana. These places would house convicts and political prisoners, so anybody that opposed the government was sent to these places. One of the most famous ones is actually called Devil's Island. It was a French penal colony in Guyana, which is in Africa. Devil's Island is notorious for its horrible treatment of its convicts. They were underfed, they were malnourished, had extremely hard labor. Not just hard labor like let's punish them and make them do stuff. It was like unnecessarily cruel. And Devil's Island would actually be a place for them to send convicts all the way up until 1938, and then they finally ended away with that practice. The British penal colonies, I did mention this I think yesterday, originally were sent to Georgia in the United States, but after the American Revolution, we kind of said, no, you can't send us any more prisoners. We don't want any more prisoners. They had to send them to Australia. So convicts in Australia came from all parts of the empire. So even though it was a British penal colony, they could have been Irish, they could have been Scottish, if they belonged to any part that belonged to United Kingdom or Great Britain at the time. Actually, I don't think the United Kingdom existed, probably just Great Britain. If they belonged to Great Britain at the time, then they were sent there. However, they weren't actually imprisoned. So in the French penal colonies, it was an actual prison. So the prisoners, lived in a prison, they worked outside, they worked in the forest, or they worked the land, and then they would be sent back to jail, like a physical location. In Australia, they kind of just like left them out there, and they were like, okay, this is your prison. The whole entire island was their prison. And so they would usually either work for free settlers, or they worked on government projects or posts. Some of them were never allowed to return home, and that was their punishment enough. Some of them chose not to return home because trying to go back all the way to Great Britain was expensive, and they'd just rather not deal with it. And they had new lives. The practice eventually ended in 1850 because the British government actually felt that it wasn't even a punishment to basically send them somewhere else, and they could essentially start over or create a new life for themselves in the new colony. And then you see also an influx of settlers coming to Australia in 1851 because they discovered gold there. So there's a mini gold rush in Australia. Okay, so migration in the face of challenges. So you have a diaspora. I mentioned that word before, but I mentioned it really early on. Diaspora is when you have the mass immigration of one people from one place over time. I mentioned it when we talked about the Jewish diaspora, because the people of the Jewish religion have been forced to move continuously throughout history. And so the biggest example that we have of diaspora is probably the African slave trade, is because they were forcibly removed from their home and then sold to countries in different places to go and work. Most diasporas are the result of loss of property, political conditions, and famine, so lack of food. In India, most of the people left because of poverty. Many left as indentured servants to go work on plantations for 5-year contracts. Again, indentured servitude means it's a limited amount of time, it's a set amount of time. You have about an estimated 1.5 million Indians who had gone to the colonies before 1916, when indentured servitude was finally ended. In China, in the middle of the 19th century, many of them left to escape poverty or famine. There was a lot of political unrest in China, especially conflict that was still left over from the Taiping Rebellion, conflict that was still left over from the Opium Wars, and people were illiterate. They didn't know how to read, they didn't have an education, they didn't have land, and so a lot of these peasants, a lot of these poor people just needed an opportunity to feed their families, and so they had to leave. They had no other choice. Most of them were male, and they planned to return home, but they left as indentured servants to go either work on railroads in the US, Canada, or South Australia. Then we get to Ireland. So Ireland also experienced its fair share of tragedy. So many people left Ireland for political reasons. Great Britain absorbed Ireland into the United Kingdom and got rid of Irish Parliament in 1801. Why is that such a big issue? So if you don't know the geography, Ireland is a separate island away from Great Britain. They're close to each other, but it's not physically joined together with them. And Britain kind of holds dominion or dominance over Ireland, and they like to remind them a lot that they are in charge of them and they are in control of them. So it's kind of a way to remind them, like Big Brother is in charge. And doing away with their parliament also does away with their voice in the government, so they don't even have a say in what is going on or what is happening politically in their country. You also have a division between religions. So you have a huge section of Ireland that is Roman Catholic, and then you have a tiny section that is Protestant. It's mostly in the northern part, in Belfast. There's a lot of violence that existed even all the way up until the 70s and the 80s with the creation of the IRA and things like that. So there's a religious division that discriminates both sides depending on where you live geographically. You have tenant farmers. Tenant farmers, they don't own their land. They kind of lease their land or they rent their land from a landowner, and many of them were being forcibly evicted from their land. And then you also have the Great Potato Famine. It was a 4-year-long famine, a shortage of food that actually pushed 3 million people out of Ireland. In Italy, the Italian unification, so if you remember, Italy was not a unified country until the 1800s. It was all a bunch of separate independent city-states. And the unification of the country actually made the people poor, which is ironic. Normally you would think that uniting a country would make it stronger, but it actually hurt them. So 7 million Italians actually had to leave the country over the course of 40 years. Most of them went to Europe, the other half went to the Americas and New Zealand. Again, mostly men with skills or farmers trying to escape the very hard working conditions. Some of them left for political reasons. They were on the opposite side of the political party that was in charge. Others were escaping organized crime, La Cosa Nostra, the mafia. So that's where we get it from. All right, so then we have migration to settler colonies. Some of the background. Most people who moved permanently around the British Empire went to settler colonies, because when you have a settler colony, it means there's going to be an established group of people that are going to stay there. They're not just going to go and take resources and then go back home. They're actually going to try and establish a community, a society, a government, a republic, whatever you want to call it. They're going to create a home base in that area. So you're going to see those settler colonies pop up in Canada, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. Those who went to other colonies usually did not plan to live there forever. For example, you have technical experts. These are guys who are like engineers and geologists. Notice how I said guys, because women, we didn't go to school at that time. So engineers, geologists who migrated to South Asia and Africa. You have Andrew Gides Bain, who went to Cape Town, which is in the very southern tip of Africa. He actually created the first geological map of Africa. And it may not seem like a big significant thing, but it actually was, because maps were really, really bad back then, and they weren't very accurate. And so for this gentleman to go out there and take the time to map it out and you know, really study the area and study the territory was extremely important. Then you also have British engineers. The problem with British engineers is that if you look at Great Britain and you look at it on a map, it's an island and you're going to run out of space. So you have so many engineers, and Great Britain is only so big that these engineers can no longer build on their homeland. They have to go to other places to build and expand in other places. So they're actually going to blend their ideas and their knowledge with people from other colonies and other areas which they go and settle in, and create these new, you know, big amazing places, palaces, buildings, monuments, museums, whatever you name it, because they can show off their talents in this kind of uncharted, undiscovered territory. Argentina is Britain's informal empire. This was, like I talked about yesterday, the playground of the rich, kind of, if you will. You had businessmen, traders, bankers moving to establish banks and trade in the area. It was kind of like their Las Vegas, if you think about it like that. It was a place for them to escape and a place for them to go and spend money. In Japan, you had the Colonization Society that was formed to help Japan imperialize. They wanted places to send surplus people, because also Japan is kind of small, and so if they run out of space to provide for their people, they need to send them somewhere, but also for their goods to sell them to new markets. They were unsuccessful in Mexico, so Mexico doesn't take well to invaders. The Japanese were leaving their home country to go study in the United States, so much so that it actually becomes a problem in the eyes of the people at the time in the United States. So there is a lot of resentment towards Japanese immigrants. They feel like they are taking over, if you will. So what ends up happening is that there's a push in the government to try and limit the amount of Japanese immigrants that are coming into the country. And so there's an informal agreement that is reached upon, and I want to say it's Theodore Roosevelt or Teddy Roosevelt, that basically agrees to what's called a gentleman's agreement. So it's kind of like a handshake. Like, you do this, we do this. It's not an actual law that gets passed or anything like that, but basically the U.S. promised that they won't pass laws against Japanese immigration if Japanese stop sending immigrants. They didn't stop sending all immigrants, they just stopped sending the poor ones. So the rich ones and the wealthy ones, the educated ones, the ones that we needed for specific jobs here in America, were allowed to come to the country. The other ones that were considered non-essential, if you will, were not allowed or not given visas or not given passports to come and travel to the United States. All right, so migration, transportation, and urbanization. Improvements in transportation allowed some people to migrate permanently and others to come home eventually. So in 1885, Japan and Hawaii made an agreement. The Japanese can freely come back and forth to work on plantations under 3-year contracts and then go home. 29,000 Japanese laborers went to Hawaii over the next 9 years. Italy had a similar arrangement with Argentina, and most of the immigrants ended up settling in cities. So here you have 2 different charts, and I'll let you guys look at them when you will on the PowerPoint slides. I'm move myself here. One of them is a breakdown of voluntary migration. So this is people who went by choice. And then the other one says coerced or semi-coerced, which is a nicer way of saying they were forced to go, different migration patterns in the 19th century. Okay, 6.7, we're almost done. Diet Coke break. You guys are going to miss that, I promise. Okay, anyways. The essential question for 6.7, how and why did patterns of migration affect society between 1750 and 1900? So migration is going to lead to demographic changes, so changes in the makeup of people in certain areas. Most migrants were male, leading to changes on home cultures. New and old cultures are going to mix to create blended societies, and you're also going to have the rise of racial and ethnic prejudice. Okay, so some changes in home societies. The roles of women. It varied by home culture and location. So in some places, males did not leave the home or the area or the territory until another male relative was of age or could come and take their place in their family. So if this was the case, then a woman's role remained unchanged because a man was still going to be in charge. Some women did gain roles outside of the traditional home when men left because they were forced to work or forced to provide for their family, and they were the head of the household. Some women followed their husbands, and they went with their husbands to wherever it is that they migrated to and wherever they went to go work. These women that followed their husbands usually played a larger role, in family decisions. If husbands returned, women often continued to play a larger role outside the home because when the husband comes back, it's going to be very hard for the woman to kind of give up the responsibility that she had once her husband was gone. So they're going to have to learn how to share and balance those responsibilities and those kind of titles, if you will. Then you have remittances. Remittances is when you have a migrant who sends money home to the family. If a remittance was large enough, women could work less and spend more time with the family. Women had considerable power in determining how remittance was spent. Remittance often meant that young children could stay longer in school. So this was the case with a lot of people. When a migrant worker comes or is in an area, all of the money gets sent back home. They just keep enough to live off of, and then everything else is sent to the family to support them, to take care of them, or to eventually, at one point, hopefully bring them over and present more opportunities for them. So that's what a remittance is. Whoops. Okay. So effects of migration in receiving societies. Immigrants wanted a new economic start, but they wanted to continue practicing their culture. So they wanted new opportunities, but they didn't want to change. And I probably wouldn't want to change either, just because that's how I am. But many of them form what's called ethnic enclaves, or clusters, or small groups, or neighborhoods of people from the same foreign country. This is where you guys get the nicknames like, Chinatown, or Little Italy, or Little Mexico, or whatever you want to have, colonias. Like places that are grouped together of the same ethnicity, of the same culture, of the same religion, whatever it may be, because it was safer for them to stay in one blended area and one community because everybody spoke the same language, everybody believed the same things, the same food was shared, and different cultures tended to not be as receiving to other cultures. And so again, people found protection in sameness. So they would retain the language, food, customs, while also sometimes absorbing new parts of the culture. They obviously had to learn the language of the country that they migrated to, and then they had to blend in as best as they could. So for example, Chinese enclaves, people migrated in search of work. Southeast Asia was thriving because of the opium farms. The opium farms were making lots and lots of money, especially with their distribution to Great Britain. Some people in Southeast Asia held posts with the colonial government, so that's a pretty high position also. Many of them became business owners and traders, and the Chinese in that area controlled trade in that region. So it wasn't like the other places where you had spheres of influence where another country controlled the area. In that specific area, the Chinese did control the trade in that location. In the Americas, many people came to the U.S. for gold. There was a gold rush here also, but there's not a whole lot of gold, so it was only a few people that made it lucky that were able to discover gold. The rest of them stayed to work on the railroads. You had about 225,000 Chinese laborers that were forced into 8-year contracts to work in Cuba and Peru on sugar plantations. Many of them stayed to help build the Andean railroads and mine guano. So Andean has to do with the mountains, I think so, yeah, the Andean mountains. And mine guano, I mentioned yesterday, guano is bird poop, which is for fertilizer. Really full of nutrients. I know that sounds so weird to say, but it is. Guano. Okay. They left their cultural stamp like Chinese fusion on food in Peru, and then sometimes they married the locals and they ended up just staying there. Italians in Argentina, it was the second most immigrated place globally behind the United States. People in this territory encouraged immigration, and they provided immigrants with civil rights. So again, people in Argentina had it a lot better off than other places. It did influence the culture and the language. Italians made up of half of the immigrants to Argentina. Even to this day, 55% of the population identifies as Italian immigrants. Why? Low population, fertile land, low cost of living, and the immigrants raised the standard of living, again, because it wasn't like one of these places where they were exporting or taking away their resources. It was more of a rich man's playground. Okay, effects of migration on receiving societies, Indians in Africa. So many Indians went to islands off the coast of Africa or South Africa as indentured servants to work on sugar plantations and build railroads. Hindus and Muslims immigrated and brought the caste system with them. Eventually they did abandon the caste, but they did keep other religious traditions, which were a part of their faith and their belief system. They did suffer a lot of prejudice and a lot of injustices that's going to carry over even all the way after World War II. So one of the most influential Indians is going to be Mohandas Gandhi. He's going to go to Africa to practice law in 1893. He obviously experienced racial discrimination because a part of the area that he goes to happens to be white dominated or British controlled. He's going to become a political activist. He's going to motion or try and create what's known as the Natal Indian Congress, which is a group or an organization that is dedicated to show the world, basically, the amount of discrimination that the Indians were facing, specifically in South Africa. In 1914, he's going to go back to India to work towards Indian independence from Great Britain. He would actually don't know the answer to this, so I'm not going to lie to you, but India would not get their independence until 1947, and I don't know if he was alive to see that or not, but eventually it would happen, but it would take place, like I said, until after World War II. So the effects of immigration on receiving societies, Indians in Southeast Asia. The biggest source of labor for British colonies in Malaya, Ceylon, and Burma, they went as indentured servants. Eventually, it was replaced by what was called the Kangani system. A Kangani system is where the entire family is recruited to work on tea, coffee, or rubber plantations. Their lives were less restricted because they had their whole families with them. You had about 6 million Indians going to Southeast Asia before the end of the Kangani system, and it helped them keep close ties with India because the entire whole family would come and work on a single plantation or an area or territory, and they weren't broken up like other different cultures were. Indians in the Caribbean, it was the largest ethnic group in Guyana, Trinidad, and Tobago, also working on plantations. They had a huge part of the population everywhere in the Caribbean, spread out. The Caribbean isn't just one location, there's a bunch of islands, and they ended up blending with the home culture. The arrival of the Indians is even celebrated to this day in the Caribbean. Okay, so prejudice and the regulation of immigration. So there's going to be a lot of extreme prejudice that immigrants are going to face. Migrants often work for lower wages than native workers. Notice how native is in quotation marks. Native here does not mean native like Native American, like Indian American, like the person who is from that area. At some point, and I'm going to reference the U.S. specifically, in the United States, after they got their independence from Great Britain, you're going to have second, third, fourth, fifth generation Americans who now consider themselves natives because they and their families and their ancestors were the ones that first settled the area. So they are native. They are from America. They are American born and bred. That's what it means by native workers. And a lot of resentment is going to come from them because Africans, Mexicans, Chinese, Japanese, all of these other immigrants, Irish especially also, are going to do the jobs a lot cheaper than these Americans are. And so the employers are going to give the jobs to whoever is going to do the job cheaper. And so there's going to be huge amounts of discrimination between these two or many of these sections. So, for example, in the US, you're going to have the California Constitution of 1879. In this constitution, it actually prohibited state, county, and local jobs from hiring Chinese workers. Non-white people could not be classified as citizens. And it actually encouraged the Chinese removal of people and segregation from towns. Then you have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese immigration for 10 years. That was extended and finally made permanent in 1902. It would stop for a little bit, and then the practice was repeated again in 1943. Tensions between the US and China wouldn't get better until, I want to say, the 1960s, when Richard Nixon made his first trip to China. He was one of the first American presidents to return to China after all of this craziness and drama was going on during the period that we would know later as the Cold War. It won't be on your AP exam, but we did talk about it in class. The Mexican reaction, the Mexicans are going to be a little bit more lenient towards the Chinese. At the time, the president is Porfirio Diaz. He's going to actually encourage Chinese immigration to Mexico. Let me explain a little bit about Porfirio Diaz. Porfirio Diaz, the guy that's shown right there in all his military garb and everything, he was president of Mexico for something crazy like 40 years. And I think the term limits on being president of Mexico are every 6 years. And it's also twice like the United States. So if you do the math, you know that doesn't add up. So essentially he was kind of like a dictator of Mexico. People in Mexico either really liked him or really disliked him. He was very... How do I say this? He was a businessman first and foremost. He wanted to make money. He wanted to make profit. He welcomed foreigners. He welcomed foreign investment. So the people of Mexico necessarily saw him as giving away Mexican territory to a bunch of gringos, if you will. And so they really didn't like that. And the reason that he wanted the Chinese to come to Mexico is because, again, they also did the labor and the work a lot cheaper than the people of Mexico. So it was kind of a way to exploit the system again. Then we get to Australia, last and finally. So, White Australia. White Australia, move myself over here. Right there. There we go. So you have Chinese immigration to Australia, which switched from indentured servants to settlers after the gold rush. Because, again, indentured servitude is going to go out the window. It's another way of saying slavery. They're going to do away with it. You have 50,000 Chinese workers coming to Australia during this time. In 1855, you're going to have the Chinese Immigration Act. Because there was such an influx, because there was such a huge move of Chinese immigrants very rapidly to Australia, they're going to pass a law that actually limits the number of Chinese that could get off a boat in a certain area. So what they ended up doing is they were like, okay, we're going to move around the island and we're going to come and port somewhere else. So they tried to find loopholes to get off in different places. In 1860, it's going to lead to conflict. You're going to have white miners who actually attacked Chinese migrants' quarters, their living quarters, killing several of them, which obviously is not good, and it's going to cause tensions between the two groups. Then you have Chinese Immigration Regulation and Restriction Act of 1861. This restricted on how many Chinese people could actually enter the colony, period. So then you have another one, the Influx of Chinese Restriction Act, in which Chinese immigrants had to pay an annual tax. They made huge economic contributions to Australia, but still the resentment grew. People were angry with them for replacing them and taking their jobs. So eventually you have the White Australia policy. They are going to limit all non-British immigration, and that would stay the policy all the way up until the 1970s. Okay, so your exit ticket, whoops, go back, is just to catch up on your missing work, guys. Enjoy your weekend. There is not going to be a video tomorrow. There is no class going to be on Friday. Make sure that you keep up with what I said, the survey, the registration, the links that are up on Google Classroom. Your teachers keep posting and reminding you guys to stay up to date on all of your deadlines. Please make sure you read those, and then be ready for DBQ practices next week. See you later. Bye.